We will be discussing his ideas on utilitarianism, what is happiness, what is utility, and how it should be used by any type of political institutions. But before we do that, let's take a look at his life. Jeremy Bentham was born in 1748 and died in the year of 1832. He was the founder of utilitarianism. He combined throughout his active life the careers of a philosopher, a jurist, and that of a social reformer and an activist. Though he was trained to be a lawyer, he gave up the practice of law in order to examine the basis of law and pursue legal reforms. His utilitarian philosophy, based on the principle of the greatest happiness or the greatest number, was aimed at rearing the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. Bentham championed reforms of prison, legislation, and parliament, and stressed the need for a new penal code for England. He has been regarded by John Stuart Mill as a progressive philosopher, the great benefactor of mankind, and an enemy of the status quo and the greatest questioner of things established. It was generally believed that he came across the phrase "the greatest happiness of the greatest number," with which his name was intrinsically associated in many translations of a writer on crimes and punishments. Some other biographers also tell that he borrowed the idea from Joseph Priestley. Well, let's take a different angle of his life now by putting pause on all these controversies, whether he took from this or that thinker. Our purpose here is to understand his life and his ideas. As we know, he was late 18th century English philosopher, a jurist, an economist, and reformer. In the history of political thought, he is popularly known as the founder of utilitarianism. He was the son of a well-to-do London lawyer. He was educated at Westminster School and Oxford University. He was a brilliant student and a profound scholar. Being qualified to become a lawyer, he chose to devote his entire life to scholarly pursuits in the field of philosophy and jurisprudence, as he had a strong financial support of his family. So there wasn't any worry to earn livelihood. And because of that only, he could devote his life to these kind of reforms. Now, he wrote in various domains, and it deals with a wide range of subjects, which includes education, logic, language, rhetoric, and religion, apart from public economy, as well as legal and judicial issues. When it comes to his works in political philosophy, a fragment on government, which he wrote in 1776, and and Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislations are the two most important works written by him. In this way, Bentham made an important contribution to the liberal tradition while he sought to demolish the earlier foundations of liberalism. How did he do that? So he began with Locke. He deprecated John Locke's notion of natural rights as simple nonsense. He also dubbed the concepts of the state of nature, the social contract, and sovereignty illogical and unnecessary to explain the origin of civil society or the grounds of political obligation. Bentham argued that the notion of utility was the most obvious reason behind the origin of the state and the logical ground of political obligation. So for him, it wasn't a state of nature. It is not because of human nature. It is not because of social contract, but it is because of the idea of utility that man enters into political society. And utility is the logical ground for political obligation. We can highlight his contribution to the development of liberalism in three important areas. First thing he contributed is that he produced a critique of Locke's theory of natural rights and provided an alternative foundation of the liberal theory. Second important contribution is a scheme of administrative and judicial organization based on the responsible exercise of power and equality. His third contribution is a political structure which he envisaged, designed to achieve the ends of legislation, including security, subsistence, abundance, and equality. And by all this, he highlighted the needs and aspirations of the modern democratic and equality-based state. As highlighted earlier, in political philosophy, he is regarded as the chief exponent of utilitarianism. Bentham begins his argument. So what is utilitarianism? In fact, his utilitarianism is based on hedonism, which refers to a philosophical school founded by Epicurus, ancient Greek philosopher. These philosophers believed that all human beings by nature seek pleasure and avoid pain. So from this assumption, they inferred that pleasure is the highest good. Human being is always running after pleasure. Bentham argues that nature has placed man under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. These two sovereign masters govern human beings' life. So human being has no choice but to obey either of these two sovereign masters. Men always tend to attain pleasure and avoid pain. In this respect, Bentham follows psychological hedonism. He further argues that these sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, not only determine as to what we shall do, but also advise us to what we ought to do. So what is compulsory becomes ethical also. Here he becomes an adherent of ethical hedonism. Now Bentham goes a step further and argues that all public policies should be designed to maximize pleasure and minimize pain of those affected by it. Now, what is happiness for Bentham? He defines happiness as the balance of pleasure over pain, derived from a thing or course of action. And this is why he asserts the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation. So this is his understanding of happiness. Now his composition of utilitarianism, which emerges out of hedonism, is based on two elements: psychological and ethical. Psychology always inspires, motivates man to seek pleasure and avoid pain. The ethical dimension of this hedonism tells man that man should work to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So utilitarianism, when it comes to making and implementation of public policy, tells that those kinds of policies should be made which will give pleasure to man and will minimize pain. Keeping this understanding of utilitarian philosophy of Bentham and his follower in mind, we can proceed further and try to understand when Bentham is arguing that the concepts of absolute right, absolute sovereignty, and absolute justice had no relevance to the realities of social life. According to them, only one absolute standard of regulation of human affairs, and that is absolute expediency. So for them, political institutions and public policies should not be rated as good or bad in relation to some visionary or arbitrary concepts of human rights and obligations. They should be judged by their fruit. Now, having understood his argument about utilitarianism, which is based on hedonistic philosophy, now we can think about his concepts of utility. So what is utility according to Bentham? Bentham, in his fragment on government, which he wrote in 1776, defines unity by referring to that property in any object where it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good or happiness, or it prevents the happening of pain, evil, or unhappiness. To whom? To the party whose interest is considered. And if this party may be community in general, it may be individual. If the community, then the happiness of community. If an individual, then the happiness of that individual. So this is utility principle given by Bentham. Now for him, utilitarianism means utility as the criteria of acceptance of the proposed option. It is the founding concept of utilitarianism. According to Bentham, the concept of utility is the keynote of utilitarianism. In this sense, it refers to the amount of one's satisfaction or increase in one's welfare or happiness that is derived from the consumption of goods or use of services. Happiness, Bentham tells us, can be estimated by the amount of pleasure derived from a thing minus the amount of pain caused by it. So there can be a mathematical calculation of pain and pleasure. And in this context, rational behavior of individual is understood to imply that he always seeks to maximize the pleasure and minimize his pain. Now, Bentham makes distinction between utility and usefulness of this thing. And according to the law of diminishing utility, different things may be identical in terms of their usefulness. But with the increase of their supply, their utility starts decreasing. So there is a subtle difference between usefulness and utility. Now, Bentham is arguing that in contrast to the hypothetical notion of natural rights, pleasure and pain were not only empirically verifiable, that is, verifiable by sense experience derived through sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, they were also susceptible to measurement. Now, one important point we must remember here is that Bentham ignores qualitative differences between different kinds of pleasure. His focus is mainly on quantitative differences between different pleasures. And that is why John Stuart Mill, who is another exponent of utilitarianism, commenting on Bentham that quantity of pleasure being equal, Pushkin is as good as poetry. This is attributed to Bentham's utilitarianism. Now let's proceed. How Bentham wants us to measure the quantities of pleasure and pain? He laid down 7 criteria for this purpose. And these are described as hedonistic calculus or philosophic calculus. What are these criteria? These criteria include intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, purity, and so on. So what is intensity? It means how strong is the feeling, how long it lasts, and how certain we feel to have it. Fourthly, how near it is to us, how early we can have it, and does it also produce other types of pleasure? Is pain mixed with it, or it is pure? To what extent it applies to others? The extent, so the first 6 criteria are meant to judge the utility of a thing or action of the individual, while the 7th criteria, extent, must be combined with them for determining the acceptability of a public policy as expressed in the principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So this is the utilitarian philosophy given to us by Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism.